Oh, you are muted. There you
Hello. Thanks. Welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I'm really excited about this one. I'm dialoguing with Since 33. Kevin runs that channel. He's done a really good job in elevating the dialogue. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to today. Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself, introduce the channel, and then we can dive into the topic?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, my name's Kevin. I run the Since 33 channel. Still pretty small, and I don't really have any particular plans for it for the future right now. But I enjoy doing it. I enjoy doing the research for it and making videos, and just presenting what I read and pretty much the conclusions that either I come to from reading the sources or just presenting straight up like here's what this author said and here's why it matters and why people might care. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, today we're chatting a little bit about the video I made a few months ago on the magisterium, and particularly, and Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, particularly the communion in two kinds video.
Right.
Yeah, and so we'll just go a little bit back and forth. I'll kind of lay out the argument behind that video, and then if you want to sort of offer your critique, and then we can kind of go from there.
For sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I argued in that video is that the magisterium is owed, per the Professio Fide, per Dei Verbum, is owed religious submission of mind and will, even in its non-infallible promulgations, even in the disciplines that it promulgates. And so if it promulgates a given discipline, at least per the theory, religious believers, the faithful, are obligated to give the magisterium religious submission of mind and will. But believers cannot be obligated to give religious submission of mind and will to an authority that explicitly authorizes and explicitly commands us to do, or commands us not to do, rather, that which Jesus has commanded us to do. The magisterial sanction that prohibited communion in two kinds in the Council of Constance is one such case where the magisterium prohibited believers from doing what Jesus said that we ought to do, and therefore it's issued a command that it has claimed under Dei Verbum that it has the authority to bind believers to, but it cannot have that sort of authority, and therefore the theory that everything the magisterium sanctions or promulgates, even in its non-infallible capacity, as binding for believers to give religious submission of mind and will, is therefore false. Yeah, so that's kind of the argument in a nutshell. Yeah, feel free to push back and offer some critique and clarification. And
yeah, that's awesome. I think that's I was just rewatching your video right now, and I think that's pretty much the argument you were making back then, whether it was a few months ago or a year ago. But I would say I think it logically follows. Obviously, the magisterium cannot go against a divine precept. Where I would disagree as a Catholic would be the fact that communion in both kinds is a divine precept.
Yep. Yeah, great. So what I'd want to then do is kind of take a look at some of those relevant texts. So Matthew 26 and 1 Corinthians 11, and get a sense of how you're reading those. So when Jesus, and especially in light of the Council of Constance, looking at the early church and agreeing that the first few centuries of the church practiced communion in both kinds, that it would seem that command, insofar as we understand the words of institutions, not to just be something that was spoken to the apostles, but something that the priest in persona Christi issues to the faithful, that the words of institutions have both the commands to take and eat and to drink. And then what the, of course, magisterium is doing is forbidding drinking under even pain of excommunication and damnation. So how do you read those? How do you read those texts?
Well, yeah, so when it comes to gospels like Matthew and Luke, I see the words of institution. I see the Last Supper as the institution of not only the sacrament of the Eucharist, but also the sacrifice of the Mass. Right, the liturgy, at least in essence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as Catholics, it's important. As Catholics, we distinguish the two. As Protestants, there's a range of like how much are you going to distinguish the two. I know Anglicans, or even some Reformed, Presbyterians, they'll talk about the Eucharist having some sort of sacrificial aspect to it.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, when it comes to following that logic to a conclusion, I think that's where the Protestant position fails to separate the two. So I would read those Last Supper scenes as the precept as the institution of the Eucharist. And I could also say it's a precept to receive the Eucharist when he says, take and eat or take and drink. But I wouldn't say that it's in both kinds. I think when I think about a passage that mandates the Eucharist for salvation as a precept, I think clearly John 6. I think you would agree John 6 is about the. I know Lutherans they pretty much deny that, but the Reformed don't. And are you Reformed Anglican? Where do you kind of try to kind of pause there?
That's
'Cause I
funny.
want to know who exactly I'm speaking to.
No, and that's a fair question. I was actually asking a couple of Calvinists about this on Twitter today.
I think I might have peeked at that a little bit. Yeah.
I kind of be what I've called a kind of Augustinian, in that there are parts of Westminster, like its commitment to perseverance of the saints, that I don't affirm. I do affirm double predestination and covenant theology. So I've kind of located myself as kind of a Reformed Augustinian, but it's kind of like a midway between Lutheran and Reformed.
Awesome. So I guess just to finish that thought, I would say John 6 is the precept to receive the Eucharist as a sacrament for salvation. Hence, Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. But for the Last Supper, I see that just basically to the apostles. And I gotta admit, at first glance, it's like, okay, well, it's weird. Jesus did this at the Last Supper. Why are we doing this differently? And even but even then, I would push back and say, even then, it would be a little awkward if Jesus says, take one or the other, the very first scene that he's going to institute this. So my point is, I'm not really surprised that Jesus said take regarding both. People want to use the word all, which I had it in front of me, but one of the gospels says, take this, all of you, and drink of it. And they want to use that word all there, but if the word all is supposed to, demonstrate a sort of precept for all, then the word all should also be there for the bread, but it's not. And so, like, obviously the Protestants are obviously not going to say, well, the cup is mandatory, but the bread is not. And so I don't think you can really get that from the word all. I think the strongest argument would be the fact that he says the word take in regards to both. And I would say, although that is, I could see why people would come to that conclusion. I think once you make the sacrament and sacrificial distinction, as I think St. Paul does really well in his letter to 1 Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 10, he talks about the Eucharist as a sacrifice. So that's why he's talking about staying away from idolatry. He compares, look what they offer to God, and the Israelites, look what they offer to demons, the heathens. Right. And he doesn't mention anything there about the subjective disposition when it comes to the sacrament. But a chapter later in 1 Corinthians 11, he's no longer talking about the Eucharist as a sacrifice. He's talking about the Eucharist as a sacrament. And now he's talking about totally different things. He's not talking about idolatry or worship anymore. He's talking about, how are you personally disposed? Are you examining yourself before coming to the Lord's Supper? And interestingly enough, and this is a very famous text that Catholics have used to defend the dogma of concomitance and the fact that communion in one kind is licit, is that he says, when it comes to the Eucharist as a sacrament, he says, therefore, whoever eats or drinks is guilty of both. So that's where I would, I guess that's where I would want to take it.
Yeah, so I would agree, actually, that 1 Corinthians 10 talks about the Eucharist as a kind of sacrifice. So the historic Anglican position has been that it's a representation of the sacrifice of Christ, such that those who participate, but it's a participatory. So the difference between the Roman Catholic and the Anglican view is that it's not so much conceived as a sacrifice that ex opere operato wins merit, that appeases temporal debt or cleans temporal debt by the work of sacrifice done, but it presents the sacrifice sacramentally to the believer, such that the sacrifice really is there, but it's there for the believer to receive into themselves in a real way. So, of course, St. Paul talks about the bread and wine that we eat and drink being a participation in the body and blood. So I wouldn't disagree that it's a sacrifice, but it does seem to be the case that, and I actually even don't disagree that communion under one kind can be licit. So like there were cases in the early church, of course, where where bread was taken to the sick who couldn't be in the gathering. And it's just a lot harder to transport wine, and consecrated wine, especially without spilling it. And it kind of still is. So that's the issue, to my mind, comes in actively forbidding communion in two kinds. So not so much just saying
Okay.
communion in one
That
kind
helps
is
me see it
worship.
better. Okay. I
Yeah,
thought, okay, that's good. We can definitely take it there. Do you want to say anything else or?
yeah. So I think I'd want to say, when I'm thinking about that text, the command to eat and drink, and then when I'm thinking especially about John 8, where Jesus talks about drinking his blood as necessary to salvation. Both of those texts in the first few centuries of church history were received in the sort of ecclesial consciousness of the church to be a command to eat and drink. So we don't have communion in one kind as the normative practice. You have it as the exceptional practice until much, much later. And so, given that the early communities received the text that way, that seems to be good evidence that that was actually what was mandated in those texts.
When you say that the early communities received the text in this way, I'm tempted to ask, what precisely do you mean? Because I've
Yeah,
done a
yeah,
lot of reading on this. I've read Melanchthon's apology to the Roman confutation on this,
yeah,
Chemnitz's. So I think I've seen as many, and I've read a few Reformed authors on it, like
yeah,
Vermigli, and some ones that I just don't remember their name. I was just scanning through a bunch of Reformed people and trying to
yeah.
read what they had to say on it. But my point is, I think by now I would have encountered a quote from a church father explicitly interpreting these texts in that way. And
Sure, sure. Yeah,
I tried to be as comprehensive as
yep,
possible. So if
yep.
what you mean by that is that the church ordinarily practiced communion in both kinds,
Yes.
I would concede that.
Right, right.
But I don't think it would follow to say that they were doing so because they interpreted these biblical texts as a divine precept to do so.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so I do mean it in that sense of that was their normal practice.
Normal
And
practice.
because
Okay.
so lex orandi, lex credendi. So because the law of prayer, which typically was about the law of the liturgy, right, is the law of belief. The liturgies and the ancient liturgies, which seem to have the consecration of both, and then the special words spoken of both. So like the body of Christ given to you, preserve your body and soul unto everlasting life. The blood of Christ given to you, preserve your body and soul unto everlasting life. Like those liturgical pieces tell us that the practice that unfolds, that sort of stems out from the wake of receiving First Corinthians, is communion in both kinds. So that seems to then be the way, if we buy lex orandi, lex credendi, that seems to be the way these early church communities are interpreting these texts.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't really see them so much as interpreting. I see them more as just adopting what they received from their fathers. So in other words, I don't think the church is saying like, what are we going to do? And I think you would agree with this. You would say, well, like they're not trying to figure stuff out. They are just receiving the tradition that they received from St. Paul down to the first, pastors and so on. But I think that when you see communion to the sick, when you see private communion, and I mean, I think it's a little difficult to tell just how extraordinary was it, because I would say communion to the sick in one kind might be extraordinary, but you already have in the first century with, in the third century with Tertullian talking about private communion at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the early church was making that distinction between sacrifice and you mentioned double consecration. I would say that's a very big testimony. The fact that you have from the third century minimum, I'm willing to bet, maybe earlier, but I haven't found anything in the 100s that is explicitly there. I was reading Justin Martyr earlier, and he says that he does mention communion to the sick. He says that the deacons take a portion of
Mm-hmm.
the Eucharist, and so, I'd have to look at the Greek because that could be something, that could be part of the Eucharist maybe in the Greek, and it really
Right.
means both kinds. But
But
I'm really,
I'd
I
be
feel
okay. Like,
confident.
yeah, I think, and I think it's reasonable even to think it could have been just like
Sure.
Tim just taking bread to the sick. The issue really turns on forbidding something that. So even if we agree that the tradition was handed down by Paul, and that the church then, as they understood being taught by Paul, when Paul uttered the words like "drink," which was an imperative, that they interpreted that to actually be a mandate to drink, which is then why they did it.
But I don't,
Yeah,
if I
go
may
for it.
interrupt you though, I don't think you could hold both. If there's a mandate to drink, then why
Yeah,
would there be any
yeah,
extraordinary
yeah. Good question. Yep.
case?
Yeah. So, namely because of the principle that we can only be obliged to do what we're capable of. So, like a command, for instance, like examine yourself, right? Presumably, infants can't. Well, I don't know how you feel about paedo communion, at least in the Eastern churches. Um, infants can't do that command. And I'm pro paedo communion, you know.
Okay.
So infants can't do that. Or we could even take the case of the mentally challenged. They in severe cases they can't examine themselves, and so they can't be held culpable or accountable to do that command. So I'd say the command applies to those who are able, but then there may be those physical circumstances that prevent one from being able, and there's the risk of actually like dropping wine, you know, having no way to safely transport consecrated wine without dropping it.
Okay, that's an interesting, because I get what you're arguing, and I'd have to think more on that, because on one end you have a physical incapability, and on the other hand you have a moral incapability. So is it absolutely impossible, or is it physically impossible to transport consecrated wine? It's not. Whereas
Yeah,
it's
that's a
absolutely
good question. Yeah.
impossible, at least on our end. At least God would grant a miracle for a
Yeah.
person who is, who has problems,
Yep.
or an infant to examine himself. So I'd have to examine that more. I don't think they're a perfect one there. Um, Something that, the way that I see this is, the church. I would lay down these three rules that I think we can agree with, although we're going to disagree on how we interpret them. Is the church does not have the right to forbid the sacraments from people. Now,
Sure.
obviously, the church, if there's like a public sinner, right, then obviously pastors should withhold communion from them.
Mhm.
And if someone says, "Oh, I'm not repentant, but I want to get baptized," like, obviously the church has the authority to do so. But
Right.
I'm saying, if someone is repentant and they want to be baptized, the church has no authority to say, I don't want to baptize you
Right.
because for a non-legitimate reason.
Right.
However, so I would say that the church cannot deprive people of the sacraments. I would say the church can also not change the essence of the sacraments,
Sure.
but the church is able to change and move around the manner in which the sacraments are distributed.
Sure.
So some things that come into my head is, like, if someone were to make an argument that, and I'm not really too read up on Anabaptists actually, but
Sure.
I'm sure they make argument. I've heard some arguments about, like, oh, Jesus was baptized by immersion. In the early church, I see a lot of baptism by immersion. And now obviously most Protestants are cool with doing, sprinkling or
Yep.
pouring. You also have in the Council of Constance the fact they admit that, and I was going to bring this up because in your video you read the canon once, and then the other ones, and the other times you didn't read it, you kind of misphrased it. The canon says, I have it here in front of me, it says that Christ instituted it after a meal and administered it in both kinds, and you were kind of phrasing it like he instituted it in both kinds. He instituted it in both kinds in a sense of, like, the first time he did it, sure, but that's just like saying Christ instituted baptism by immersion. And obviously someone's now going to try to make the argument, oh, that means that baptism should always be by immersion.
Sure.
So going with all this craziness,
Yep.
I'm not really giving a coherent
Yeah.
thought, but what I'm saying is, if someone wants to be baptized, the church cannot say, assuming they're repentant and they have genuine faith and they're not trying to, they're not heretics, the church has no right to say, no, we're not going to baptize you.
Right.
But the church does have the right to say, you're going to get baptized by immersion or by sprinkling. Sure. And I would say the recipient has no right to say, no, I demand a baptism by immersion or a baptism by sprinkling. When it comes to Catholic sacraments, I can give this example. The Catholic Church says to be married, it has to be in a church.
Sure.
Would technically a marriage in a beach count? Yes, but you have no right to demand that.
Right.
You have no right to demand a confession in a particular manner. It used to be public, now it's private. So I can go on and on about all these different manners of administering it.
Yeah.
There was this the Ebionites. They were I think early church, I think 3rd or 2nd century, maybe a little later. But basically, they were saying that the Christians had to observe the Old Testament rites, and that included communion with only unleavened bread. So the church, for a time, banned unleavened bread. Yeah. Right. So in other words, all of these things, whether it's baptism by immersion or sprinkling or marriage at a beach or whatever, none of these things would change the essence of the sacrament, and it wouldn't be depriving people of the sacrament. But the church has the authority to move these around, and because I do think the biblical evidence, especially when St. Paul says either or, I think there's some typology that can be involved, but those are more from the spiritual sense, and so that could be a topic we can leave later for the video, or not bring it up at all. I think the biblical evidence suggests that as a sacrifice, both need to be present, but as a sacrament is either one is neutral. I know it seems a little weird because, like, I can't fathom, like, only receiving the bread, but I think that's really what the biblical evidence points to. The last thing I'll say, and I'll let you, I know I've said so much, so you probably have a lot to say, but the last thing I'll say, and I really like this, the Council of Trent, in defending this a century later after the Council of Constance, says and I'm paraphrasing in my mind, but this would be the 21st session of Trent, where they're defending communion in one kind. It says the same person, Christ, who said, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood," and the very same passage says, "Whoever eats this bread will live forever." So I think when it comes to the sacrament, the Bible is very clear that either one is fine, both is fine, one is fine, zero is not fine, because otherwise you don't have a sacrament. But in one, you have just as much as a sacrament as both. And I have more to say, but I don't want to say anything.
Yeah. So I think one of the key differences, there are two key differences with baptism, is first, the Didache mentions sprinkling, which is written in presumably apostolic times, or at least proximate enough to the apostolic community to tell us that it has a high probability of being apostolic. Whereas I don't think we have anything quite like that with normative communion in one kind. Again, we do have those exceptional circumstances, but I don't think we have anything quite like that with normative communion in one kind. But then the second thing is that, and one of the key differences is that part of the matter that Christ gave, like when he's at the supper, part of the matter of what he's administering and what he's instituting, when he says, if the words of institution are, this bread is my body, right, and this cup is my blood, right, and both of those are part of the words of institution, then what he's pronouncing over the cup and then what he subsequently gives immediately in the wake of the words of institution is directly connected to him instituting both of those elements as symbols in the sacramental sense, not the Baptist sense, as symbols of those realities. So it seems to me that the key difference there is still the command of Jesus, whereas that's not true in the case of like sprinkling. The command Jesus gave is be baptized. We know baptizo can be used in either way, just from a lexical study. And then the Didache tells us that that was a way that early apostolic church actually practiced baptism.
Okay. So I think you explained to me that, the difference between ordinary and extraordinary use. But I really don't totally see it, because at what point would it become, I guess, is it just pretty much when you can't? So in other words, if the church is just being lazy, would you say that would be going against the command?
Yes. Yeah, I do think that. Yeah. So I think there are times where we've probably taken advantage of that, and we've been kind of lazy and licentious and not given wine where we ought to have given wine. But so, because I agree with the sacramental principle, but nevertheless, the command of Christ is still there. And so I think, ordinarily we're actually supposed to strive to give both kinds in obedience to the command of Christ.
Interesting. How would you, I guess, when I interpret it as a Catholic, that this was a command, I guess you could say a command in that time for the apostles who were present. How would you, is there really anything else to argue from the biblical data or from the early church?
Yeah.
And I know you said, the early church practice,
Plus
that this is supposed to apply to all future generations, because I really don't. I think what you're outlining is not what I'm seeing in the early church or in the Bible, where it's like when he says take and eat and take and drink, what he really means is try your best to take and eat, take and drink.
No. So I think any given command assumes that those physically, just by the nature of a moral, like as a philosophical principle, just by the nature of a command assumes that those physical, it doesn't apply to those physically unable. So like if I said to a room, right, do a bunch of jumping jacks, like, and I just give that command, like implicit philosophically in the command is the recognition that one can only be morally obligated to what they're physically able to do. So I just think that's actually inherent to human commands as a whole. So that's why it wouldn't be. It's not just a try your best. It is a command, but then the exceptions are legitimated when there's physical incapacity.
Okay, interesting. So, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think more about that, because I've never really encountered that. When I read the reformers on this, when it comes to communion of the sick, I'm pretty sure the Reformed are pretty much against it. Vermigli, in his tractate on the Eucharist, was he was saying that he acknowledges the existence of communion to the sick early on, but he says that he thinks it's only valid if they would have celebrated, like kind of redone the liturgy in front of the sick person. I don't think I've actually encountered someone saying that this is just a command, and I haven't really thought about it that way.
Yeah, yeah, and it tends to be you. I believe maybe one of my listeners can correct me because I have a number of Lutheran subscribers. I think it's actually Gerhard's argument, and there have been now in Anglican theology there have been two sort of minds of this in the Reformation. There have been some that thought consecration remained, and some that thought that the use of the elements didn't remain after the service. I'm in the camp of the Caroline divines, which did hold that once consecrated, always consecrated. And so we actually have to be careful about how we treat consecrated wine.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So getting into the history, do you see something like, for example, are you familiar with the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified?
Mm-mm.
So the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified, pretty sure it began in the 4th century, 300s. And the way that it would work, so I guess here an objection could be that it didn't happen, it wasn't frequent, but it only happened during Lent. In the West, I believe it only happened on Good Friday. And in the East, it happened, I'm pretty sure, every time that Mass was celebrated during Lent, except Sundays. But I don't quote me on that. I'd have to go back and reread these specifics. But what I do know is that in the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified, what they would do is it's called pre-sanctified because they were pre-sanctified gifts. And what would happen is usually it would be received in one kind, although they would sometimes give unconsecrated wine with the consecrated host
Yeah.
reserved from the previous day. Or they would dip the host in the consecrated wine from like a previous Mass, although when the actual Mass of the pre-sanctified came, they would administer just the host. So people would argue like, well, technically there's consecrated wine mixed in with the host, but realistically, we know that's only one kind by the time it's dried up and all that stuff.
Right.
So would you see, because when I look at that, I would see that as like the church in the early on tried their best to do communion in both kinds. They saw no reason to change it, but they did not have this idea of this precept to receive in both kinds. How would you see something like that?
Yeah.
And if you hadn't heard of it, then I don't expect you to have too many thoughts without looking into it.
Yeah. So I haven't heard of that before. My initial thought is just to say, like, I really, and it seems like it seems that in my reading of the liturgies of the 2nd and 3rd centuries that the elements that we eat are ordinarily, and of course they're so consecrating the elements in front of the sick, like that's totally legitimate, like that's possible. So I'm just thinking out loud here, but ordinarily the priest did that in front of the congregation in part as actually to get at that image of the whole congregation being assimilated to Christ in the Eucharist. So I would be against generally using unconsecrated wine at all in communing people. I really think we shouldn't do that. It seems like all of the liturgies assume that when you take the wine, they're assuming that it has been that the epiclesis, that the blessing of the wine has already taken place by the priest. So I think we should just not use unconsecrated wine at all in a Eucharistic service.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Does it make it invalid? Obviously, we'd agree.
No,
I think we both agree. No,
because you still have the host, which technically, but it is. I would say that actually isn't. That's not giving full obedience to what Jesus told us to do.
So when I'm trying to kind of see your left and right boundaries, because I don't think I have within the Last Supper scene itself. I don't think I have. I could say that this is a precept that should be observed when possible. But not but it obviously not at all, absolutely all times. But I think going outside of there, I would say that that it's not a precept at all to receive in both kinds. And in the church history, how would you see other accidental properties of the supper? So, for example, when he says take and drink, and in the East now they do intinction, or I think actually in some Protestant churches they might even do intinction. Do you see that as something that applies to the precept, or is that
good question. I think it's a form of drinking, like to my mind anyway. Like, so intinction is it's intended to be a form of drinking, an unusual form of drinking. And generally speaking, I don't think it's ideal, but it still seems to my mind to be a legitimate form of drinking.
Okay. And I assume these actually aren't, you can make an argument for it. I don't think they're that strong, because I think it's a little obvious. Some things are disconnected, some things are not. But like fasting before the meal, or before the supper.
Yeah.
stuff like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think the church can have authority to do that. So a priest, for instance, or a bishop can say, this is something we do to prepare our hearts and something I want the people to do. And because the bishop is an authority, the people ought to listen to that. But that would be different than forbidding something, forbidding a command of Christ. So if we found in the New Testament a command that said, do not fast prior to taking the bread and wine, which we don't find, but
Right.
just for the sake of example, then the bishop couldn't. Like that wouldn't be a legitimate use of authority. And I think that's actually what's going on in the Council of Constance.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, and you didn't bring that up too much in your video, so I was glad that you didn't make that a point of it. Just thinking of something right now. So when it comes to part of the reason, another part of the reason that I have trouble accepting this as some sort of precept for the future church at all times is when it comes to other things like baptism.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's weird because the Eucharist is two kinds. Like there's no such thing as like two elements in baptism or penance or anything like that. But I think something that is a little more similar is in the New Testament, you have consistently pretty much automatic baptisms. You don't have any catechesis going on.
Right.
And you could always make the argument that there's no explicit command to believe and immediately be baptized.
Right. Exactly.
But you can make the argument from Acts 2:38, like believe and be baptized. But now, but very early on, the church, changed that and said, well, believe, be catechized for 2 years or however long, be baptized. You have the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. What's stopping me from being baptized? Right? Nothing. So I would see that as another example of the sacrament of baptism cannot be denied. The sacrament of the Eucharist cannot be denied, but the manner in which it's administered, whether you have to wait a year to be catechized, I think obviously 10 years would be absurd, but the church has the authority to change the manner in which. Do you not see that parallel in the Bible?
Yeah. So I would agree with that principle. The reason I don't think it applies here is because it's more analogous to saying that a catechumen can't be baptized, let's say, with water, or can't be baptized, with in the name of the Trinity or something like this, right? So it's different.
Sorry, help me see that. Say it again. I'm trying to.
Yeah. So
what is more analogous?
The Council of Constance.
Okay.
So the difference there is that the Council of Constance is actively forbidding someone to actually do something that Jesus gave an imperative to do, whereas it doesn't seem like Christ or his apostles gave an imperative to be immediately baptized right after. And so the church in her prudence might actually say, okay, we're in a historical situation where, we need to catechize people because too many people are maybe getting immediately baptized. They don't understand what they're doing. So it's actually wise to catechize for a while before baptism. But that wouldn't be actively forbidding something that's a command in the New Testament or in any of the records of the apostles.
But you wouldn't see Acts 2:38 as a command that. And I don't see it as a command, obviously. I don't think one should, but I'm trying to use the same logic, and I admit it's hard because the Eucharist is two things. So it's like it's very, baptism is not water, and like you also add in something else afterwards. Right. But I would say trying to use I'm trying my best to use the same logic that you're using to Acts 2:38 with St. Peter, and I don't see why I wouldn't come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, so namely because it doesn't seem like St. Peter's saying repent and be immediate. He just says repent and be baptized. And so there's no sort of there's no like time command there. Whereas in the case of Jesus and the words of institution, he says take and eat and drink. So it seems there you have an explicit command to drink.
What would be?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue against the fact that Jesus says take regarding both, but is there? Let's try to imagine let's say the Catholic Church was right that it's not a divine precept to receive in both.
Mm-hmm.
What would the text have to say? Because otherwise, we got to make that to be very awkward. Why would Jesus tell the apostles take or eat or drink or anything like that? It's just.
Well, I mean, or I think actually would be. And what we'd have to see is either that, or what I would expect is that in the early church, there was a normative practice in at least some places, if it was a plausible reading. So this isn't even like a sort of demonstration, but just as like if that were a plausible reading of that text, that in the first few centuries we would find it as a normative in some places for the people of God to only take one kind. Because like, and here's what I'm assuming about like just texts in general, especially of the ancient world, that the texts are sort of written reifications of like a community. They're sort of a snapshot of a community at a time. So the community before the text and the community after the text can also help us as a hermeneutical key to tell us what those texts meant in their practice as well. And that's part of what motivates me to hold lex orandi, lex credendi. And so if we would find that anywhere in the first few centuries it was normative to hold communion in one kind, that would add plausibility to that claim. But it doesn't seem like we find that, like, if I'm not mistaken, like anywhere where that's normative.
Yeah, normative as in like if you want to take that as the majority, definitely not.
Well, I mean, like in terms of like the people of God coming together either at a house church overseen by a priest, or or in like the earliest structures that started to be built in their gathering, right, where communion was administered in one kind unilaterally.
One kind.
Yeah.
So I've heard that, and I haven't looked into this myself. I've heard that when you have private communion at home, which is very early, and I'm not talking about the sick. I'm talking about specifically people would reserve part of the Eucharist after the liturgy.
Right.
I've heard that they would only partake of the Eucharistic wine in the chapel, but I have not looked into that specifically, so I'm not willing to. Don't quote me on that. I'm not willing to put that forward here.
But presumably even they're doing that. So those who reserve it, they're not sick. They're doing that after already having eaten bread in the common gathering. So they're kind of doing that, it seems to me, as an extension of that meal that had already taken place.
But I'd say it's still a different time. So if you're eating the Eucharistic bread at home a day later or 2 days later, obviously that's not the same liturgy that you partook of. Especially if someone were to reserve hosts from one day between liturgies, now you don't know which host was consecrated exactly at which liturgy. You're taking communion in one kind as a separate instantiation, I would say.
No, it would seem so, like in the same way that each Passover under the Old Covenant was seen as sort of the representation of the initial Passover, so a kind of participation across time in that initial Passover. It would seem to me that like taking communion at home after already having taken both kinds at the gathering is one of those kinds of instances where they're sort of participating in an event that's already taken place. So it's not that they're doing some like kind of a new sort of instant, because there's no sort of, if they're taking consecrated wine, there's no sort of new liturgy that's being done. They're just kind of drinking the wine or eating the bread. So to my mind, that means that they would see that as just the extension or participation in the event that already took place.
Interesting.
Which had both kinds.
Yeah. I don't see any of that reasoning being argued by the reformers. I'm interested to read Gerhard, but when I read Chemnitz, for example, I was reading Chemnitz and I was reading Bellarmine's response to it, and Chemnitz, his argument was that it doesn't matter what they do at home because it's not the liturgy. And my response would be, it's like, well, that's exactly the point.
Right.
The fact that the church was able to, the fact that the church distinguished between the Eucharist as a sacrament and as a sacrifice. The church never compromises. The church never compromises communion in both kinds when it comes to consecration. So like consecrating both.
Yeah.
But when it comes to receiving, I guess if you're willing to admit that, I'm trying to. I think, in a sense, I'm not trying to say this in a rude. I think your position is a little bit unfalsifiable, because when I look at the early church, I would expect communion in both kinds as the normative practice, and that's fine, and not deduce from that a divine precept to receive in both. But the communion in one kind at home is an extension of that at Mass, so it doesn't really count. I mean, when I see it, I just see it as communion in one kind. I mean, it's a totally different event that's going on here.
Yeah. So
Sacrament versus liturgy. And sorry, and just and one more thing. Or you can go ahead. I kind of forgot what I was
saying. Yeah. Sorry about that.
You're all good.
So the reason like I go that way is because it's not simply church practice nor simply scripture, but the way both of those mutually confirm each other. So Scripture has Jesus uttering this imperative, and actually, Paul as well, talking about the cup that we drink. um, to drink, right, in Matthew 26. Well, then I look at church history to say, okay, how is that imperative being practiced? Which I'm assuming their practice sort of is a concrete reflection of their understanding, and therefore, how are they understanding it from their practice? And so I think it's the best synthesis of both of those together. Now, I think you're right that Lutherans read the data differently, but a part of that has to do, at least to my mind, again, Lutherans can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that a lot of the Lutheran scholastics thought that after the service, consecration's effect essentially ceases. So it essentially goes back to being normal bread and normal wine after the service.
And so do the Reformed in general.
Yeah, right. And there were some Anglicans that thought that, but the Caroline divines actually, I think Cranmer's a little bit difficult to actually get a read on him on this, because it does seem like he has a kind of weird quasi sort of middle way where the curate, after like any extra, basically the curate's supposed to eat. Which is interesting if he had just, and he never, to my knowledge, says it goes back to being normal bread and wine. So there seems to be evidence that he didn't think that. But certainly the Caroline divines don't. And that would be the stream where I follow.
Okay.
And that seems to make most sense of Scripture's command and the way it's practiced in the immediate wake of Scripture.
Gotcha. Because I feel like I could just object and say, if you were supposed to do it ordinarily, and communion in one kind is supposed to only happen extraordinary, I would try to argue saying, okay, but by that logic, the church shouldn't be allowing people to take communion home, because that would require them, if they can't take the wine home, that would require them to do it in one kind, and communion at home is not absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
But you would just say, again, it's an extension of that, and so
right. Well, I'm actually, so personally, I'm okay if there's a safe way to transport wine, like a safe, responsible way to do it. I have no actual issue with that. And with people taking consecrated food home. Actually, people in our church actually sometimes do. Like, there are some people I bring the Eucharist to after service. And like, I'd want to ask, why are they saving it? And if their intention is like, well, because we want to participate in the Eucharist, that was already celebrated. Typically, that's the language that gets used. So we want to participate in the Eucharist that was celebrated, because those parishioners and of course myself would hold that consecration means the effect remains.
Awesome. I think the last point. There's a few points I could bring up. A lot about the spiritual sense that I've been thinking about, spiritual sense in Scripture, and just so we don't have to get into that, what I've kind of noticed is, whenever the Eucharist as a sacrifice is foretold in the Old Testament, it's foretold, at least as far as I'm concerned, in both kinds, so double consecration. But when it's foretold consistently as a sacrament, pretty sure it's always foretold as one kind. And even in the Gospel of John. And again, this is a little murky because it's a spiritual sense. It's not so much the literal sense. But even the Gospel of John, you have John 6, which very frequently talks about the bread. And you have John 15 after the supper, where Jesus is talking about being the vine and the branches, and that's Eucharistic language right after drinking wine. And he kind of separates the two into instances. I would point forward to the showbread in the temple, the fruit from the tree of life, all of these things. If these are figures, if these are types, and they are to be, and we have to look for their fulfillment. Obviously, the tree of life can only find its fulfillment in one kind. The bread from heaven can only find its fulfillment in one kind. And there's the argument from Chemnitz saying, okay, but they had bread from heaven and water from the rock. And then Bellarmine responds like, no, but those were in two separate occasions, so that still qualifies as one kind. I don't really want to go there unless you would like to.
Well, yeah. No, let's. So I think it's also important that, like, I would take. So I'm curious what you think about this. That Isaiah 25, when it envisions wine flowing from the mountains, right? I actually do think a legitimate spiritual sense of that is a fulfillment actually in the Eucharist, as well. And it talks about, the meat of the soul, well, there it's just meat, but like, I would say the spiritual sense of that seems to correspond to the meat of the soul. And wine is there as well in Isaiah 25. So like, and I also do think it's important that you're right that the spiritual sense finds its fulfillment in the New Testament, but the New Testament also sort of specifies the exact mode of fulfillment, right? So just because like individual images or images of one kind might be used in the Old Testament pointing forward, that doesn't necessarily mean the reality to which it's pointing forward is only in one kind. And then our Lord, him giving the command for both, would then tell us that the way that's being fulfilled is both in bread and wine.
Would you see the same thing about the John 6 and the bread of life
Yes.
discourse? That
Yep.
it's okay.
Because he uses both bread of life and drinking his blood.
Okay. Well, I think I'd respond to that is that if we both hold that Christ is fully present, body and blood,
Mm-hmm.
soul and divinity in both species, then
Yes.
he, as a mandate, as a precept, he requires the Eucharist to be received as for
Sure.
salvation, body and blood. But when it comes to receiving the Eucharist for salvation, he says, "Whoever eats this bread." So, but again, I don't think you'd have a problem with that based off what you just told me.
No. Yeah, which is why I think which is why I think it can be done at all. But the I think it's also important to say, like, I never want to give a theological rationale that minimizes or allows me to not do an imperative that Jesus gave for me to do. Like, if he gave an imperative, like, I just want to do the imperative, like, even if I have a theological rationale that would say, well, like, and I do, like, the body, blood, soul, and divinity are present in the bread. Therefore, like, why do I need the wine? It's superfluous. Like, it comes down to the fact that, well, because Jesus told us to do it.
Okay. So the last place I would go for scripture, and this one is also a little murky, but following St. Augustine, I'm told St. John Chrysostom interpreted it this way. I haven't been able to find where he does. But I know the Catholic authors of that time and later St. Chrysostom did, and a few others. In Luke 24, are you familiar with Luke 24, the Emmaus
Mhm.
Road passage?
Yep.
It seems to me, if obviously Jesus is never recorded to say, "This is my body," but it seems to me like that is very, very indicative of the Eucharist. What would you say about that passage? Because
Yeah,
I guess
yeah, yeah,
ultimately the argument argument is brought forth is very similar, sentence structure as the Eucharist.
yep,
He gives it to them in one kind, or he just gives
yeah.
them the bread. It says, and he immediately disappears. How would you
Well, yeah,
and
yeah,
and Chemnitz would, for anyone listening, I know you're probably gonna already know this, but Chemnitz would say, or it's either Chemnitz or Melanchthon, I forgot. They said that, oh, but this isn't a command. This is only him demonstrating himself, right? Like he's doing it. But
sure.
he's not saying do this. And Bellarmine responds, I think, pretty well, saying, we're not saying there's a command to only receive in one kind. Obviously not.
Yeah, yeah.
Jesus never said only receive in one kind. We're just saying it's possible. We're, as a church, we're able to receive in one kind. What would your thoughts be on
Yeah.
that? Do you think it's
Yeah,
the
so
Eucharist? Do you think it's not?
yeah, that's a really good question. So there are two kinds of thoughts there. I think it's vague. I think I would lean towards it being the Eucharist. But the way I'd go is by pointing out that, like, the phrase breaking of the bread, I think is actually probably just a synecdoche, because it's kind of rare, it seems to me anyway, to have Jewish meals where that are sort of like reminiscent of the Passover, where wine isn't there. So the phrase breaking of the bread is kind of just like it's a synecdoche for the wider meal that's going on at that moment, which probably would have had wine as well. Now, that's not decisive from that text, and I fully admit, like, that text doesn't tell you one way or the other. But then I would read that text together with Jesus's command and together with the way Paul tells the Corinthians to practice it, just to confirm that, if that is the Eucharist.
Interesting. Okay. Because the way I would read that is, because one could argue, be like, okay, you Catholics think that it's mandatory to consecrate in both kinds, but Jesus is never recorded to grab wine in that meal.
Sure.
What I would say to that is, and the reason I really try to ask myself, like, am I just trying to read this into the text, or is there a good reason to believe it's the Eucharist? Saint Augustine believed it was the Eucharist,
Yeah.
and he didn't seem to have a problem with it. Is even though, um, it says that Jesus gave them the bread and immediately left. It doesn't say anything
Sure.
about him giving them the cup. It does refer to it as the breaking of the bread, which St.
Right.
Luke refers to the Eucharist as. So I could say, as a Catholic, what happened there was the breaking of the bread, which is the Eucharist, a valid Eucharist, which is consecrating bread and wine. But he very clearly records him giving them the bread and immediately departing from their sight.
True.
So it
Sure.
seems to me like you said, I can't say that's exactly historically what happened, because
Yeah.
it's the text does not literally say that. But if I were to use the way that St. Luke, what he calls the Eucharist, the breaking of the bread, and what literally happened, what Jesus did with the bread that he consecrated, give it to him, and then disappearing, it would seem to me like that's kind of what happened.
Sure.
You know.
Sure. So there's sort of two things there. Like if it was the Eucharist, and if I'm right that it's a synodoche, right? And in the blessing of the bread, he blesses both, but only gives them bread. He's certainly not forbidding them from drinking wine, right? Like they're actually, the wine's there, presumably at this sort of the Seder meal, right? And so they're actually still free to do it. It's just he himself only distributes the bread, having blessed both. And then I would look at then again those other texts to say if that is the Eucharist, that's probably what's going on, by looking at like St. Paul and the words of institution.
Okay, interesting. How do you read? I guess this is my last question, and then we can
Yeah.
we can either take questions
Yeah,
or
yeah.
my last question would be is why do you think St. Paul would say that whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup?
Or rather than and or.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think he's demonstrating, like he's arguing that the effect, because or can be kind of a logical operator, you know, like it's that, or and can be a logical operator. So it's not just that you sort of need to disrespect both, like in order for the curse to fall on you. It's that if you disrespect either of them, you know. So he's emphasizing the fact that it's not just about disrespecting sort of the meal as a whole. He's actually emphasizing the importance of the elements themselves to say, you shouldn't take any of these elements unworthily.
Yeah, because as a Catholic, I would use that to prove concomitance, which I know you have no problem with.
Mm-hmm.
But I would take it a step further and say that there is a possibility of receiving one in the normative sense, because he's not talking about extraordinary cases. He's talking about the liturgical gathering. So the fact that St. Paul is talking about the possibility of receiving just one in a liturgical gathering,
No,
unless maybe they're now, there's people who want to abstain from alcohol. I assume you're okay with that.
yes, yeah,
Abstain from the cup.
Right. That would be a physical.
I guess that's something you could respond. But what it seems to me is like St. Paul is not only teaching concomitance there, but acknowledging the possibility of not administering in both kinds at a gathering.
Yeah. Well, so the reason I'd read it differently is because the warning there, well, that like whether you the disrespecting bread or wine there is given in the context of the warning, not when he's initially starting, right? So when he's initially starting, he's just quoting the words of institution. So when he's uses that word or, he's specifically talking about the warning and the real possibility of the curse falling for disrespecting either element. So like, for instance, like if someone takes the bread and then, like, so in Anglican churches often, when we receive the bread, we pause, we make the sign of the cross. It is very possible at that moment, right? Like if you see a sister, like it's possible for someone to lust at that moment. Mm-hmm. And let's say someone did, right? And then they were unrepentant about that lust, and then they went to the cup, right? Then the curse would fall on them. So I think St. Paul's emphasizing the fact that it can actually fall on you if you're dishonoring either element.
I get what you're saying, but I don't think that really. I think that's a very specific example of what could happen between the exception of one or the other.
Yeah, and that's just one example. I think Paul's he's trying to cover all cases of like, possible, all cases of possibly disrespecting either element. But he's not saying you can take either or. He's saying that if you disrespect either or, the curse falls on the person.
Okay. How long? I guess this is my very last question. Actually, no. Let's take questions because it's getting.
Yeah.
I got a message tonight.
Yeah. Let's see here. So yeah, go ahead if you guys have questions. It looks like there are 11 or 12 people. Sometimes these counts aren't fully accurate. There is a Q&A. Sorry, I should have put this one up earlier. Will there be a Q&A? Yes, there is. Okay. So the first question we have here is, what was Eucharistic practice like in the 1400s? So I'll give my understanding if you want to give your understanding as well. My understanding is that Jan Hus and John Wycliffe are actually bringing back. So by this time, communion in one kind had been standard for centuries. That was at the time the normative practice. Wycliffe and Hus are pushing back on this, among other things. But they're pushing back on this actually largely using the reasoning I'm using, that Jesus commanded it to be taken in both kinds. So we shouldn't actually, we can't say no to something Jesus said we should do. We can't forbid something Jesus said we should do. And so even though it was standard in one kind for centuries at this point, Huss and Wycliffe are pushing back, pointing back to both the Bible and the first few centuries of the church.
Yeah, I would say I'm not exactly sure by percentage how widespread it was. I know it wasn't universal, but when for example, like at the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, 2 centuries before that, he records in his Summa, he's asking the question whether it's valid to receive one kind and not bread and not the wine, and his said contra is it's already a practice in a lot of churches, even before St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1300s, I believe, or it could be 13th century. I know the number 13 is important there. But the Easterners are actually already critiquing the West for doing this, which I found funny because they were saying that their reasoning for it, at least one of the Eastern theologians, was that they were depriving the faithful of the blood. But if that were true, then they wouldn't be practicing communion in one kind during Lent and the Mass of Preach Sanctify. So it was kind of like, come on, man, go read your own liturgies. But it seems to me like it was widespread in the 1400s. What I would call a heresy, which was that communion in both kinds required for salvation, arose. And to counter that heresy, the church said, okay, now it's not going to be up to the local parish or the local diocese. It's going to be universal communion in one kind.
Yeah.
After Constance, right?
Go for it. Yeah.
No, so after Constance. And
go for it.
And one more thing, I tried my best looking for. I think it was. Have you read Huss's or who was it?
Wycliffe?
No, not Wycliffe. The other guy, Jacob of Mies. He was the other one.
I've read
Huss's contemporary.
I haven't read Jacob of Mies.
But you read Huss's argument in this topic specifically?
Yes. Yep.
What does he make? Is that the argument that he makes that Christ commanded it for?
Yes.
Because I guess I know we're taking questions now. We're not talking anymore. But yeah, I would say a distinction I would make is a commandment for the people and a commandment for the apostles at the time. Because when it comes to baptism, and this is so difficult because communion is very unique. Like there's nothing you can compare it to because it's the only sacrament that exists in two kinds. But when it comes to baptism, like obviously a very clear mandate to baptize all. But when it comes to receiving the Eucharist as a precept, I would say that's for the apostles there. Like the you there is the apostles. And I think what Huss was doing, and maybe what some of the reformers were doing, is they were saying that instance we're supposed to replicate it. And I think that's kind of what you would argue.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And that's exactly right. And that is my position. Yeah.
And to make a clarification, but the fact that I don't think Jesus, I mean, there isn't a point where Jesus says that this is the precept for the future. You would say that was like a command for then, and that serves as a precept for the future, but you wouldn't say that there's a precept for the future the same way there is one for baptism.
In terms of, no, I actually do think they're analogous and I think with baptism, right, we have baptism of desire, just because like to use any other matter, like to baptize someone, I don't actually know a case where someone would be like physically able to be like baptized in mud, but not water or something like this, but like in any case, the matter is water there. At least,
I wouldn't be, definitely. Cause I would say that's part of the essence of the sacrament. I think you would agree that with me there.
Right. And so at least with communion in one kind, in those cases of like physical incapacity, and that would be the only time, like, and again, the cases, as we talked earlier, where someone's taking something home, I would see that as actually a continuation of that celebration that was celebrated on Sunday. But in the case of the sick, like there's a physical incapacity there. At least in that case, you still have the matter. You still have part of the matter being used and no contrary matter being used. So it's a less than ideal sort of concession to like the physical circumstance. But yeah, I would say that it seems that in the way the church's liturgies understood the words of institution, they understood it as spoken sort of prophetically to and for the church, even though it was immediately spoken to the apostles. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to?
No.
Okay.
I think we answered that question well.
Okay, let's see. Okay, let's see. So here, could the Church of Rome ban baptism? So I'm guessing that would be a question for you. My impression is that the magisterium wouldn't, but like,
I kind of I kind of answered that.
Yeah.
From my perspective, or not my perspective, excuse me, from like the Catholic perspective
Yeah.
is, and I'm just repeating what I said in the beginning. I assume maybe Risto didn't hear from the beginning. The church, one, has no right to refuse the sacraments from people. Obviously, if someone's not repentant, they don't have to baptize them. If someone is a public sinner, they don't have to give them the Eucharist. But if someone meets the criteria to receive a sacrament, the church has no right to refuse that sacrament. The church cannot change the essence of the sacraments, and the church has the authority to change the manner in which sacraments are received. So the church cannot say there's no more baptisms, but the church, I'm not gonna stick on my middle finger here. The church can say, church can't say there's no more baptisms. Church can. What was my second point? What was my second point? They can refuse the sacraments. They can't change the manner of the sacrament. So the church can't say, hey, we're going to baptize with just oil now and no water.
Right.
But they can change around the manner. And I think I don't think there'd be a disagreement with you,
Right.
at least there. You could say the church. I don't think you'd say that like someone has the right to demand sprinkling baptism as opposed to unless there's like a medical whatever. But generally speaking, I think we would see that either. I think if I understand you correctly, you would add a fourth condition saying, even though that the sacrament the sacrament of the Eucharist exists equally in either kind, I think we would concede that. You would say that changing, receiving in one kind doesn't change the manner. Is changing the manner, but not the essence of it.
Right.
Essence would be more like doing it with water, like some people were in Africa with Saint Cyprian. He was writing to them, or using crackers instead of bread.
Right.
And you would say that the church has some authority to change the manner in receiving it in the sense of intinction, or maybe before fasting and stuff like that. I think you would add on and say there is a precept to receive in both kinds.
Yeah.
Ordinarily, is that right?
Yeah, basically, yeah. So with the caveat that they can't ban something Jesus gave as an imperative.
Yeah. And you would say Jesus gave both kinds because I'm tempted to respond, Jesus gave us the Eucharist. The Eucharist exists in both kinds. So the church is not banning the Eucharist, but I know you're not saying that. But it's really hard for me to, and we're not going to discuss that because we're taking questions, but I think,
and I would see those imperatives in like eat and drink. So in Matthew 26, like that he gives both of those as commands.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no, the church can't ban baptism.
Yeah. Let's see. Another one from Risto. Why did the Church of Rome ban the cup in the West, but not the Eastern churches who are in communion with the Pope? I actually don't know the answer to that question.
I mean, there's plenty of things that are decreed universally, but only apply really to the Western, to the Roman Rite. Partly because what I would call heresy, saying that that communion in both kinds is required for salvation, didn't really affect the East much. So I mean, they have no point in following that.
Yeah, and in all honesty, like, so I do have to go back and read. I need to go back and read Huss to see if he said that statement in particular, because that would be interesting. And I wouldn't. And
please let me know. I am following. I'm pretty sure the Catholic Encyclopedia on this. I think they're pretty trustworthy, but I haven't been able to read the original Huss or the original Jacob of Mies.
And I need to just read Jacob.
I read some of Mies, and it was in Czech, and I had to translate it with ChatGPT. So that was tough. But
yeah. Okay. Anselman, wasn't the one kind communion taken to the sick who couldn't attend mass? I think we covered that. Yeah. So.
I was going to say something. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I would say yeah.
Okay. Let's see.
Well, okay, wait. I'm reading the question better now. The one kind communion was also, and we did cover this. It was also for private communion at home.
Yeah.
So you would take the Eucharist home, usually, under the form of bread. I'm not aware of any under the form of wine alone. That would be really weird and hard to but it would be under private communion. There are in the I think 7th century, there are instances of communion in one kind in the liturgy, and there doesn't seem to be any reason for it was extraordinary. Like there's this one in I think it's Sozomen, or is a church historian later on.
I think Sozomen,
Sozomen. He records that this person took a piece of the Eucharist and immediately left the liturgy. But even then, I admit it was not like a universal thing. But there doesn't seem to be any extraordinary thing attached to that.
Yeah. And the difference there between us would be, I would just see that as an extension for those who aren't sick. like and they're taking bits of the host home as that they're extending. That's an extension of the celebration that already took place. Yeah.
I think the one at Sazum, if you're talking about private communion, we talked about that, but regarding the one at Sazum, it seemed to me like he partook at the actual liturgy. He only partook in one kind at the liturgy.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
But
even though both were offered.
I'm already thinking how you're going to respond. I think you might respond saying that's like 8th century. That's not early enough to be
right. And I fully admit the process, the practice grows in the medieval era and then becomes standard. But yeah. Let's see. Okay. Here's another one from Rousseau. Isn't Paul chastising the Corinthians of preventing some of the laity from denying others by going ahead and not leaving some for others? I mean, in my own view, tell me what you think. I think, again, for me, the stronger argument is just the fact that Jesus commanded it. Here, Paul's point is exactly to say, like, essentially, don't be gluttonous, like, and don't treat the Eucharist as like, okay, now I'm going to eat lunch or something like that, and so you're essentially just like eating, lots and lots of bread or whatever. That's not what the Eucharist is for. So yeah, that would be how I read that. The communion in both kinds imperative comes from the words of Jesus and the words of institution.
Yeah, I would just simply say there that yeah. Well, he also says don't get drunk off of it, which is obviously really bad.
Yeah.
But like let's say that right now I'm in a church where I'm in a parish where we can receive in both kinds, and there's a line for, at least when I've been to the receive in both kinds, there's a line for the bread and there's a line for the cup. If I were to go up to the cup and drink all of it, the priest is not going to say, "Oh, it's okay, don't worry about it." Either kind is fine. The priest is saying, from my point of view, what's called positive law, the fact that the legislators of the church have the right to change this manner of it. If the priest is saying we're going to receive in both kinds right now, there's no reason why I would go against that.
Yeah,
that'd be so absurd. Yeah. But yeah, that's how I would see it. That's all.
Jay Edit says, joined late. How does AA respond to? I don't know. How does AA?
I think it's you.
Okay. Oh, Anglicans. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I was like, alcohol. Go on. What? How does AA respond to the argument that in 1 Corinthians 11:23-26, where Paul uses a suppositional phrase for the wine, but not for the bread?
Kind of already. Yeah.
Right. And let me just pull up that text in particular, just so we can read it. And again, feel free to give any thoughts, any pushback.
Should be
actually have
11... What was that?
I have a Catholic Bible right here. Actually, it's an ESV with Apocrypha. It's just kind of a random.
It's 11:20, chapter 11:27. If you want to read it.
Okay, so whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For if anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body, eats and drinks judgment on himself. So yeah, that first or, as we mentioned earlier, I don't think that's sanctioning communion in one kind, but specifying the fact that if one treats either of these elements unworthily, they're guilty. Now, interestingly, actually, in that passage, Paul says, for instance, in verse 28, let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So I think the function of 27 in that context isn't to say you can take either one and that be fine. It's that you can actually dishonor Christ by dishonoring either element.
I guess I'm responding to everything too. Sorry, I thought you were going to say, I thought you were going to move on, but I appreciate you for letting me speak.
Yeah.
I was going to say, so when we read these verses, right, like St. Paul saying, he has another verse where he says, as often as you eat the bread and drink the cup, that word and there, right? How do we understand that conjunctive sense? And I would just say is like, that is what the Corinthians were practicing. I don't think that's sufficient And again, you said your main argument was from the institution, not so much from Paul. But
Right.
I would say that is not sufficient to deduce a divine precept for and. Whereas in
Mhm.
the or, I do think primarily he's teaching concomitance, but I think it's a little weird if no one was receiving in one kind, or if it was impossible to receive in one kind. Um, Ordinarily, then I see it a little weird, but I do concede it's primarily for concomitance there.
Cool. Let's keep going. Okay. Also, what does Anglican aesthetics think about the argument that the command to receive under both kinds is for the apostles because they were consecrated as priests, and so they had to complete the sacrifice? Yeah, so we kind of touched on that actually as well. The reason is because the consistently the words of institution narrative is seen by the early liturgies as bringing in the community of the church. So Matthew, in Matthew 26, records that as part of the consciousness of the church, that Jesus is actually speaking this, yes, to the apostles immediately, but that scene is prophetically being spoken over the whole church, which then would explain, to my mind, why both in Corinth, in the early apostolic churches, and in these early centuries, the normative practice is eating in both kinds.
Yeah, I would just say that even though they were being consecrated as priests in the Last Supper, um, I would say Jesus was the celebrant, and I'm not
Mhm.
really sure. I've heard any Catholic theologians say that the apostles were both consecrated and co-celebrating.
Mhm.
Um, Also, it's kind of funny because it doesn't say that he himself took and ate of the bread and the wine, so like that'd be a really hard road to go down. I do believe he took and ate, but again, if we're going just off what the actual gospels say literally happened, um, I think both sides are going to have an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Uh, so his
A lot
next
of controversy.
question, yeah,
But I guess
is
there's not that many viewers anyway, so that's fine.
is what's the argument that the command from Christ was one of divine law rather than positive law? I mean, I think simply for you know, yeah, to my mind, it's because he's God. And so whatever Christ commands is like essentially of divine law. Whatever Christ is telling his church to do, we need to do because he is the Lord incarnate.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think the text really tells us. I would personally, um, I think by default I would see it as a positive law as a legislator, and the same thing with Saint Paul. And I would see the early church communion in one kind, private communion, uh, as an example counter to that. And I've never heard anyone say that that's just an extension of the liturgy. I have to go and think about that. At first glance, I am not totally convinced, but I'd have to go think about it. I've never heard that, to be honest with you. Would you mind just quickly explaining how would you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the assumption is whatever Christ says of his church, like unless we have a reason that's intrinsic to the text or somehow reflected in the practice of the early church, of those apostolic churches, those apostolic communities as hermeneutical, as the right hermeneutical context in which to read the scriptures, um, then we have to assume it. I think the default should be for risk of not doing something Christ tells us to do, that he's speaking of, giving commands of divine law. I can't actually, I can't think of another actually, and to be like, I'm trying to think of one, like, I can't think of another command Christ gave that I would say isn't of divine law. Like,
I
I'm
was
just trying to, yeah, go for
I
it.
was asking more, how would you come to the conclusion that when the early church took communion in one kind at home, that was seen as an extension
Oh yeah,
of.
yeah, yeah. Because they don't reconsecrate it. So because of that, they're seeing at this as participating in that reality that has already been celebrated. So because there's no new celebration, it's participating in this celebration that has already happened.
Interesting. Yeah, I would see it more as the fact that the Eucharist is both. I mean, I've said it a million times this video, but is both a sacrament and a sacrifice, and so you can receive the sacrament without necessarily being present at the liturgy at the sacrifice. And then the
Got
question comes
yeah,
into
yeah.
like if you're reserving all the. I'm not sure how the Anglican Church does, especially the one that you attend, but like when you have a bowl of
Mhm.
pre-consecrated hosts,
Yep.
um, it's like, well, if you take this one, you're participating in a mass that took place 2 weeks ago. If you take this one, you're taking place in a mass that took place 3 weeks ago, or that was consecrated at this mass. I think that's a little complex, although I'd have to think more about that. I've never really encountered that argument. I think it's simpler to say once the mass is done, the mass is done. But the sacrament remains. That's the way I would see it.
Yeah. So like one way to think about this is essentially that. So yeah, if we take we don't actually use pre-consecrated, like it's the priest isn't praying a blessing over pre-consecrated host when the priest is consecrating at
neither we don't pray over that, but we might consecrate one and then use more
an old one at the if you run out or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think one of the ways to think about this is each sort of mass that's being celebrated is sort of like, we can speak of like different instances, but each of them is a sort of participation in Christ's heavenly self-offering to the Father, which is why I think you could think of it as, I'm taking this and participating in that past one, but that's not contrary to actually participating in this present one either, because both are actually participations in the heavenly self-offering of Christ.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it sounds like a little bit of a, and I don't mean this in a rude way. I just think at first glance, it sounds a little bit as an undefeated position, because someone could just say, well, by that standard, well, I could only receive one kind in the liturgy, and I'm taking part of the whole thing, which is what we're kind of saying. But you would just say it's not so much again. The extraordinary cases is the ordinary cases. You're just against, if the church has no good reason to restrict it, the church cannot do it.
Yeah. I think the church can't restrict it out. So the church can't ban it at all, like to my mind. So
even if there was like let's say I know you don't think it's a heresy, but even if they're saying that there's a heresy that people must receive in both kinds, right, to counter that heresy, you don't think so either. No. That would be
I think the right response is just to catechize well. It's not to ban the laity from doing that because Jesus told us to do that. Let's see. So we have another one from Risto here. What are the downsides for the laity not taking the cup and for only the priest taking the cup? So I assume that's to me. And I think the major downside, just to like hammer away at this, is to my mind, not doing what Jesus told us to do. I think that Jesus gives, like, even if we do agree that Jesus' body, blood, soul, and divinity are fully present in both kinds, even if we agree with that, I think there's actually grace to be offered, sheer grace to be offered for the soul, and doing something because Jesus told us to do it. And so the downside is the laity not receiving the grace of simple obedience to Christ, at least in that respect. Now, there may be others, and again, it's not like that's going to like cast them out of the kingdom or anything like that. Like, they're still receiving grace; it's still good for their soul, but that would be the downside, is not obeying Christ at that respect.
Yeah, I would just say, like the Catechism says, communion in both kinds is a more complete sign. Just like baptism by immersion is a more complete sign, right? It signifies Christ's death a lot better than like sprinkling does. So I'd say you're missing out on the completeness of the sign, but you're receiving the same grace as if you were to receive in one. Most theologians, most Catholic theologians, and the Reformed concede this. The Lutherans are like a little more weird about it, but the Reformed concede that one kind is equally efficacious as two on the part of the recipient. But basically, most Catholic theologians believe that communion in one kind is just as efficacious in grace. There are some Catholic theologians, and I think very little, who say that both kinds gives more grace, but that one kind is still sufficient grace for salvation. So in other words, when the Council of Trent or the Council of Constance say that it's more of a negative, not a positive affirmation. So the Council is not saying that that one kind equals the same amount of same amount of grace as both. It's just saying you're not deprived of any necessary grace to be saved. In other words, it left the question open. You're free to believe that both kinds gives more grace. That's very minority among Catholic theologians.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that. That's really interesting. Jay Edit says, another Q. Do you guys cover Tertullian's letter to his wife where he describes her taking only the bread in secret with her new husband?
Yeah, we did. I won't say anything about that. You can have the only word on that.
Yeah. I mean, with her new husband. Actually, I'm trying to remember actually that particular circumstance. if you remember
He
it.
was, yeah, he was so he was writing to his wife, and he was talking in this particular section. He was talking about the downsides of if she were to remarry a pagan man, and he starts listing all of the not weird, but practices that Christians do that pagans wouldn't understand. One of them was like making the sign of the cross before going to bed and this
Oh
and that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
He
Oh,
was
yeah.
the pagan husband would have thought that she was doing like black magic or whatever.
Yep, yep,
And then the
yep,
other one is like that secret bread that you take before
yeah.
meals.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So to reiterate, yeah, I'd see that as an extension. So it's participating in that Eucharist that was celebrated already, where she presumably would have received in both kinds. It's just, and that's why there's no new consecration. So it's just participating in that celebration that has taken place. Anselman asks, Anglican Aesthetics, have you read Darwell Stone's Study of the Eucharist in Anglicanism? I've yet to read it, just seen extracts. I actually haven't yet. I'll flag that. Yeah, I'll flag that when we get off here. I'd be happy to. Let's see. Another one from Risto. What arguments do the Eastern Orthodox make against Catholic in general or on this? I'm assuming on this topic.
I'm assuming on this.
Yeah.
I think they would just make an argument against tradition, against like practice, against because I do admit like the church, like there is no good reason for like if the concern is spilling and the concern is there's a lot of people at this like cathedral or whatever. If I'm at a local parish and it's a daily mass, there's 5 people, there really is no strict reason to not receive in both kinds. The reason I'm totally fine with that is because and something that we would agree on is I'm not deprived of any grace in receiving one kind. I'm receiving the whole Christ. And what we would disagree is I truly see it as neutral in the sense that, like, sure, I could say it's a more complete sign, but I see it as neutral in the same way I see baptism by immersion or baptism by sprinkling neutral. So to answer the question is the EOs are just going to make that argument from like, well, you guys sometimes don't have a very good reason to do so. You're sinning against tradition, and as I said, it's a little silly because they themselves on during Lent they kind of do the same thing.
Yeah. Now I'm curious because I'm curious if they have a harsher stance actually, because my stance is I think it's illicit for the church to ban the Eucharist in both kinds because it should be normative that we take it in both kinds. But I wouldn't say like Catholics are like that is not the reason. Like that doesn't. First of all, as people know on my channel, I think Rome is a true church. But like, secondly, like I wouldn't say that their Eucharist is invalid because it's only like if someone only takes in one kind. I'm curious what the Eastern Orthodox, if they have
I've never read it on that particular question.
Yeah.
I don't know if they'd be willing to do so. The question I would ask is, what can the church regulate? If I were to ask the church, I demand a baptism by sprinkling. The church I have no right to receive that.
Right.
So if it was in one of the Lenten liturgies, and I went up to the priest and said, I demand to receive wine, not just one particular priest, but I'm saying in general, what would be the Eastern response to that? I'm curious. I wonder if they would say you're receiving, the whole Christ in this, so you don't have to receive in both or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. I just thought this next pair of comments was kind of nice. It's from Young Anglican, just hopping in now. Glad folks are talking about this. Yeah, he is.
Does he have a channel? I only know him on Twitter.
He does. He actually does. Yeah, his channel. Yeah. So yeah, if you click his channel name, Young Anglican, it'll show up. It's really good. And then Risto responded, agreed, since Cat 33 is a good Catholic channel. Yeah, I've been appreciating the content on your channel. I think you're doing a really good job just raising the dialogue. Where is the command to consecrate the elements? That's a fair question. I think both of us would agree, probably, that the words of institution like have a kind of implicit, like when it's spoken, the church immediately takes that up and speaks that over the Eucharist. And then in her liturgical consciousness, so that is to say in the way she understands that text reflected in her practice, and because at least I believe in the principle lex orandi, lex credendi, that the command to consecrate the elements is implicit in the words of institution and then made explicit in the immediate reception of the text. There's no, I think like Justin Martyr actually talks about praying over the elements for the invocation of the Holy Spirit to change the elements. So it seems like there isn't like this centuries long gap between there isn't a century long gap between consecration and the life of the apostles.
Yeah, I would say it's implicit, but not so much that we need to deduce it from I guess action. I would say in the words "do this," the words "do this in memory of me." I don't really know Greek, but you can look it up. It's a very common
Common
Catholic.
basis. Yeah.
It's very well. I'm saying it's a common Catholic arguing point against like evangelicals that the words "do this." When you go back to the Greek Old Testament, it was usually said in a sacrificial manner. So when Jesus
Sure.
says "do this in memory of me," it's contextually in that culture would have meant offer this as my memorial
Sure.
sacrifice. And I'm
Yep.
not trying to get
Yep.
into the discussion of seeing a sacrifice or whatever, but I'm
Yep.
saying I think the words "do this." I don't think the words "do this" is saying offer this,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
again in the sacrificial context you require both kinds for it to be a sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I would just say this: if a priest was to to say this is my body and then just like walk away or whatever, I would say that would be an invalid mass.
Yeah.
It would also be very illicit for him to do that because he's
Yeah.
not. It's but if someone were to walk up to the altar after the priest left and particularly the Eucharist, that'd also be weird and probably shouldn't do that. But it would be a valid sacrament. Like it wouldn't be.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because again,
Yeah.
mass is this is the distinction between sacrifice and sacrament. That I would say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So from our perspective, it actually wouldn't be the Eucharist. Like maybe we would use the language of like there can be Eucharistic moments, like so like having fellowship is Eucharistic or like stuff like that. So maybe it could be Eucharistic, but we would actually not say that that's the sacrament. They're receiving the sacrament of the Eucharist.
Interesting.
Yeah. Let's see. Young Anglican says here. I think taking the body and not the blood isn't a problem in form but intention of reception, so it is valid but illicit. Would be tantamount to the church commanding that we ought to receive without gratitude or without faith. I mean, again, my argument is mainly just like Jesus commanded it. That is really what it boils. And the church can't, to my mind, forbid something which Jesus gave an imperative to us to do.
Yeah. Let me reread that question. That was a little weird for me to read.
Yeah.
It is valid, but so isn't a problem in form, but intention of reception. Yeah, and I mean, so you have the Pope Gelasius I and Pope Innocent. I think it's Pope Innocent in the 5th centuries. They say that they do have a quote. This is used a lot by the Protestants during the Reformation, saying that you need to receive in both kinds because a separation of such a sacrament cannot happen without sacrilege. And the immediate context of that was like the Manichaeans were receiving in private, and so they would abstain from the body and not and they wouldn't they would receive the bread, but they would not receive the wine because they did not drink wine. And so if you're a heretic and you're a Manichaean, like heck yeah, you should not be receiving the Eucharist. So it's obviously illicit to you, but that doesn't automatically apply. And Sean would totally agree with this. If you're like struggling with alcohol, you don't have to receive in both kinds. So I bring that up in the purpose of like intention. He said intention of reception. It would if you're abstaining from the cup for an illicit reason, then totally. But I don't think we disagree there. I think that's more of a traditional Protestant argument.
Right. Yeah. Young Anglican asks, I haven't read that Tertullian letter, so this is just conjecture, but is it clear that the bread is the consecrated host? I mean, I in my memory, it seems like he's talking about the Eucharist, so I'm assuming yes.
I can give me 1 second. I'm going to let you know if I can pull it up because I forgot how many chapters that or how many books it has. It has 2 books. Just gonna pull it up real quick. Why don't you go to the next question? I'll get back to that. I can let you know.
Yeah. So Jay
question.
says, I'm saying in verse 25, so clarification. He did not command that we should drink in commemoration of him, but that whenever we do drink in memory, we should do what he did as often as you use the chalice of the year. So yeah, but in Matthew 26, Jesus says, take and eat and drink. So Jesus gives both of those commands. Now, again, it's true that St. Paul, in quoting the words of institution, do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, for as often as you eat and drink. So yeah, but I'm reading both of those together. So I think it's important that in Matthew 26, Jesus actually gives the explicit command there. Now, I guess I think that's actually all I have to say on that.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say particular in this one. I've heard this argument be brought up before. I'm not particularly convinced of it. Saying like as often as you do. Sorry.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Tertullian one, he says, so I'm just going to read it. Shall you escape notice from your pagan husband, hypothetically, when you sign your bed or your body? Presumably they would they maybe make the sign of the cross over their bed or something. I don't know, but definitely over the body. When you blow away some impurity, when even by night you rise to pray, so waking up and praying at night, will you not be thought to be engaged in some work of magic? Will not your husband know what it is which you secretly taste before taking any food? And if he knows it to be bread, does he not believe it to be that bread? This is like italicized, that bread, which it is said to be. So I think if this is in the context of Christian practices, and Tertullian is warning about the husband not knowing that there's that bread that is said to be. It'd be very weird to say that this is just like some sort of bread that was left over that was not consecrated.
Yeah.
For it to be a Christian spiritual devotion at home. And when you get to Saint Cyprian, century later maybe, or shortly after. I'm really bad with church fathers and exact times, but it becomes very clear. So I would use Saint Cyprian to interpret Tertullian and say that's very clear what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Young Anglican, as a follow-up, I think asks, could it be some type of blessed bread like antidoron? I'm actually not too familiar with that term, antidoron.
Neither am I. I think strictly from the text, sure. But I think in the context of what developed to be the practice, I mean, you can take an interpretation of it, being maybe it began just as being blessed bread and it eventually became the Eucharist. But there is a point in the late 3rd century where it very clearly is the Eucharist. From the Tertullian text alone, I guess not strictly speaking, no. But I don't think Protestants I don't think I've ever seen that objection. I've never seen a Protestant say, "Oh, that's not the Eucharist." I think they'll say all sorts of things, but I've never seen them deny that.
This is from Anselman. Question for you: do you know of an early discussion of baptism by sprinkling or pouring, and does it allege full immersion was the apostolic norm?
No, I'm not well read in the early baptismal controversy on this. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, the Didache mentions that sprinkling happened, but yeah, I don't.
It did say it as an exception, though.
Yeah, which is fair.
I know because I was listening to James White, and he was saying he's obviously a Baptist, and he was saying, did you note that? Because he was reading through the Didache in a video. He's like, did you note that it said if there's no running water available, it's only in exceptions. Yeah. So I assume that's probably the type of argumentation that some Baptists would make for that.
Well, yeah, that's kind of odd because it's like, I mean, so Anglicans historically have said, like we want to actually, and maybe you would even agree with this. Like if we can, we want to do it actually by immersion. But like that's not for the sake of validity. It's just because of the imagery. I think.
I would agree. I would agree, and I would apply that to the Eucharist. And I know we wouldn't agree there, but and I've already said that. But yeah. But I'm not well read on that. So
let's see here. Another one from Jay, and this is a 2-parter. What about divine law responses when Christ says, "Do this"? From your logic, it would seem that we'd have to do all that he did, which means given a broken host, and also he gave in the hand. Also, he gave it after the supper, and he gave it under unleavened bread. So if his command was divine law, it would follow that we would be bound also to do these things I listed here. Response. So yeah, I don't think that would follow because the commands are given in his imperatives, right? So it's not that I'm not when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," right? Exegetically, that's indexed to exactly what he says in what he said before and after, right? And so that "do this" is then indexed to take and eat and drink in remembrance of me. So I don't think it would follow that we would have to do sort of these like liturgical motions, like giving a broken host or giving it in the hand or doing it after supper or things like this, but that this references take and eat and drink.
How so would you say that you would say that communion to the sick is in one kind okay because it's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that someone who is not sick but for whatever reason could not make it to Sunday liturgy, so they didn't partake in both kinds? I think you'd have to say that. Would you not have to say that the private communion would be illicit from that liturgy, or no?
From that, no, I don't. So if there's some physical, because that would fall into that category, the same
extraordinary.
logic. Why?
Okay.
Right. Well, yeah, and the same logic why it would be extraordinary for the physical for the sick person is because there was like a physical barrier there, presumably from them being able to come. Yeah. Let's see. And I think that's all of the questions. Young Anglican's comment there was he was baptized by triple immersion as an Anglican in a river, which is common for adult converts like myself. Actually, yeah, that's probably true. I've seen that in my own in the liturgy we use in our diocese as well. It's usually by triple immersion.
Yeah. I was actually very, very lucky to receive by immersion. I am a big fan of receiving, the full sign. When it comes to confirmation, my priest, some priests just dip their thumb in the oil. My priest would like pour half of the bottle in everyone's head. So
it's awesome. Yeah. That's great. I love. Yeah, there's something really sweet about that imagery too. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions. Do you have any last thoughts? And if not, where can people go to find you? And what's something you're excited about? Something you want to put on people's radar?
Yeah. I mean, since 33, you have to spell it out. So, but maybe if you search just the numbers, the digits 33, I might pop up. I don't know. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm going to be honest. I have not heard this sort of argumentation before. You said you read it in Gerhard. I'm excited to go read that at some point. But yeah, I feel like
I should clarify specifically in terms of the reason for communion in both kinds being just the command of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Forgot where I was going with that, but I feel like this is an issue that at least when I've seen other, and I gotta admit this is one of the better responses because and in a sense, I know this sounds a little bit it sounds mean, but I don't mean it in that way because we get told as Catholics all the time, your position is unfalsifiable. I think this position is unfalsifiable because you're sticking to those verses of take in regard to the bread and take in regard to the blood. And so I'd have to go and try to limit myself to the verses to kind of think about it. And when I read Protestant, the original reformers or the ones that came after them, they don't restrict them to these verses. They're using more of a holistic purpose. And I think that's easier to argue against. And it's more, that's more simplistic than what you're sticking to here. But for the future, I'm excited I have a few videos planned. Got a lot of research to do, pretty busy with work, really busy with class. I have an essay due in 3 hours. I'm almost done.
Wow. Yeah. Kudos to you for being here. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. But I'm excited. I have what I do is I make the thumbnails, and if they look cool, I get excited to do the research for them. So just check out my channel.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to end the stream here. God bless.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. God bless.